So I'm Mark.
And I'm John. By definition, I think.
And Carolyn did a great introduction, actually. I'm not sure how much there is left to say.
Aren't you an alumna? Aren't you an alumnus here?
I am. So here's what's great for both John and me about being able to speak at an event like this, and that is that between us we have 5 degrees from UC Berkeley. So we're going to play, most of the time it's like, yeah, I went to school somewhere else, but I teach at Berkeley. So what's wonderful is not only did we get a number of degrees here, but we get to come back, and we've both taught here for more than 15 years.
What it also means, of course, is that we can go from alumnus group to alumnus group, and we all belong.
Yeah. So we'll start with, before we get into this topic, we thought, how often do we get to do this? Is there anybody here from the class of 1982? Grad or undergrad?
Oh, we got
no,
somebody, wait. Somebody close. Close enough.
81 is close enough.
Do we have a winner?
Rebecca,
yes,
give the man a book.
We have a winner.
Give the man a book.
We have a winner.
Oh, now everybody's going to be raising their hands. So 1982, undergrad, the year of the play. I was a senior here in the student rooting section, and typically whenever I launch a new class here, I force people to watch that. It becomes less and less relevant, but still it's relevant to me. The other thing that's great about that as an undergrad is that Rich Lyons and I were both undergrads here in the same year and graduated the same year. So from time to time, we go back and we share some stories and some common friends.
I never thought about it before, but you know, we should show that down at Stanford to the band as an example of a colossal failure.
By the way, for those of you that don't know, in the great new Memorial Stadium, if you go through in one of the hallways there is a plaque with the beat-up trombone from the trombone player in the play. It's got a big ding in it and a bent, so go look for that. All right, number 2. Anyone here, MBA, class of 1986? Oh. 87? Where's 87? Close enough. 87, close enough. All right. Now, John, we're slightly different eras. Do you want to give it a shot?
No, we've already given away 2. Let's not go overboard.
All right, we have more books to give away. So just stay tuned for questions. That's a good opportunity there to get a book. So one other thing that I guess I'll say is for those of us of the vintage that I just talked about, when we went to school, especially in the business school, we were in the basement of Barrows Hall. And it is so wonderful to be able, for those of us that are coming back that didn't have this great facility to be here, and for us to be able to teach here, and also to see the expansion that's going on right next door as we continue to grow Berkeley as a world-class top 10 business school. So, so for those of you that also suffered through the basement of Barrows, we have something in common. And maybe that's a good segue to the book and the topic that we're here to talk about. And as Carolyn said in her introduction, we're here to talk about a topic that really nobody likes to talk about, which is failure. And we give ourselves a little bit of an asterisk on that topic here in Silicon Valley, because perhaps nowhere else in the world is it more permissible to at least acknowledge your failures and share what you've learned from them. But as we teach innovation and entrepreneurship, and John and I both do that here at Berkeley and around the world, and have visiting executives and students from around the world, this topic of how we deal with failure, how we process failure to drive some of these other elements around success, is one that we realize doesn't translate terribly well. And in fact, as we had the opportunity, with Rich's blessing, to launch a class here on the topic of failure, and we called it the other F word. And we started giving talks about this around the country. We realized that this was one of these topics that we wanted to not just kind of get out of the closet, if you will, but to say, what more can we learn from it? And let's see if we have our first failure in technology. We do.
Let me check.
The great thing about this topic is that if it doesn't go well, then you're just doing an example. You can tell bad jokes. People don't laugh. You go, that's okay. This is actually part of what I'm trying to share.
And it's always good in a situation like this to have somebody else to point to, right? It's the beginning of that blame and shame culture around failure. It's not our fault.
It's not our fault.
No, it can't be. And it was working just before.
Yeah, yeah. And it was just working.
Keep going. Vamp a little bit.
So let's keep talking about this topic. Here's an example of that brought things into a little bit of stark relief for us when we went out and we spoke to a number of our alumni groups. That was at the end of a talk, and you might do the same thing, and we may not be sure how to take this. At the end of the talk, normally you have a number of people. We saw Tim earlier. There was a crowd around him. Everybody wanted to talk to Tim. Now, when we would give a talk, there would be polite applause, and everybody would walk away. You know, we knew we had taken a shower that day, and we thought that they had been engaged. And what happened was the discussions that took place later, typically there were drinks, et cetera, people would come up in small groups, and they would say, oh, we have it. I'll still finish the story. They would say, this is a topic we can't talk about in our organization. Our organization is all about success. If we try and talk about failure, you know, we're ostracized. It's not really something we can talk about. So that kind of brought it into stark relief. And now we can get on with the presentation. Is that right? Great.
We're on.
So if we take a look at what every organization is looking for, what all of you are doing that are leaders, entrepreneurs, members of teams, you're looking to drive growth. Right? Growth is the mantra. What does every publicly traded company CEO look for? We want to talk about growth. We want to talk about earnings. We want to talk about those elements. The other thing that they always talk about, that we always strive for, and we talk about here all the time, is innovation. And the third element that we look for, and the numbers on this when we say how many employees are this way, is do we have engaged team members? Do we have engaged employees in our organizations? Those are really, from our standpoint, three core elements that leaders want, organizations want, entrepreneurs want. How do we leverage failure to help drive that? And that's what we're going to be talking about here in the hour or so that we have. Now, what we want to avoid is what actually my MBA class of 1986 classmate Scott Adams so adroitly describes and illustrates in Dilbert, which is disengaged people, cynical employees, lack of innovation and growth. When Rich, I missed Rich's opening comments, but when Rich opened here today, did he talk about our 4 key defining principles? Great. Rich always does. And what's great about this is that when John and I had the opportunity and presented this concept to teach a class, Rich said, look, this is really consistent with our 4 defining principles. The way that we would leverage and embrace failure, the way that we would help drive innovation and growth are hugely consistent with questioning the status quo. As Carolyn said in her introduction, confidence without attitude, always being a student, and thinking beyond yourself. So we wanted to acknowledge that this is really a place at Berkeley where a course like this can happen, where dialogue like this can happen, and where a book like this can begin a deeper conversation. So as we've talked, as I've referenced, this is really a topic that we think about a lot, but it's not a topic that we talk about a lot. So here's the assignment. We get to be professors here, and you get to be students again. Here's the assignment that we have for you. Take 30 seconds and think about a failure that you've had, a business failure, a project failure, and what you learned from it. Just want you to think about that for 30 seconds. Thank you, John.
Starting.
"30 seconds is a long time."
Lots to choose from.
How are we?
10 seconds. 5. Time's up.
Great. Now, first of all, is there anybody here that has had no failures whatsoever? All right, good, good. So we've got that. So take that concept and turn to the person next to you or in a group of 3, and you have 1 minute to share what was it and what did you learn from it. Ready? Go.
And then we'll flip roles.
Yeah, we're going to flip it after that.
Click. Click. Click.
All right, ready? Now switch. Whoever was speaking, listen, and vice versa. The beautiful thing about this topic is that we're all expert at it. Every organization, every individual, and by the way, you just got in on one of the dirty little secrets of how Mark and I teach here, because we love class participation. What a great way to get class participation, right? Something that everybody knows about, everybody's experienced, everybody's committed. We're probably doing it in many ways that we don't even know, and even more that we probably know but don't acknowledge. So this is a topic that is universal. It's one that is universal by age, by culture, by business, by industry, by title, you name it. The world is wonderfully expert at committing and experiencing failures. In fact, we're struck by an acronym that came out of World War II. It's an acronym that some of you may know. It's called SNAFU. What you may not be familiar with is what that acronym stands for. Situation normal, all fucked up. And you might be tempted to challenge that assumption about reality. And let me just combine that with the companion idea. Yes, we live with fuck-ups. In fact, so much so that our publisher, John Wiley, when they saw this, they said, well, how about this as a cover for your book? Now you can see this guy's talking about free, right? Or failure. He must be, but I think we can identify with this picture because it's kind of how many of us react when we first encounter failure. And when that doesn't go well, we've then got this other problem of just being in the middle of situations when shit happens. In spite of ourselves sometimes, or we would like to think that it's in spite of ourselves. So we thought it was only fair for our readers and our students to understand how Mark and I define failure. And this is basically the operating definition that we use. Failure are basically mistakes and unwelcome outcomes that matter. In other words, we're not just interested in minor errors, we're not interested in small fry failures, if you will. We're interested in people understanding what is it that matters to them, to their organization, to their function, to their business, to their organization. And recognizing that it has both that fuck up and shit happens dimension to it. It can be a mistake, something that we do ourselves, or it can be an unwelcome outcome of something that really didn't have much of our fingerprints on it, but nonetheless characterizes it and ends up as a failure.
Now, we talked about snafu. We could have filled slide after slide after slide with statistics and data about just how prevalent failure is. I don't care whether you're starting with sports, with Michael Jordan, you know, who missed more than he hit in terms of baskets, or if you want to go up the curve here, major IT projects. I'm sure many of us have been involved with either designing, selling, or trying to service major IT projects. Guess what? Most of them fail. Most startups die in their first 18 months, somewhere between 60 to 70%. Even venture capital funded startups, right? Here we are in the hallowed halls of Silicon Valley. Venture capitalists are some of the smartest people around. They do due diligence on all these startups. Guess what? Even venture capital funded startups, about 3/4 of them never return the money that was put into them. It gets worse. Anybody do New Year's resolutions last year? You know, you want to read more, travel more, be a better parent, a better lover, whatever it might be. How's that working for you? It's tough. It's tough to change yourself even when you're the one that wants to change. And it's not surprising that over 80% of New Year's resolutions fail. That's why we keep doing them year after year, you know, thinking we might get better. You know, new products. I think many of us in the audience have been involved in designing, creating, or offering marketing, even financing new products. The verdict's not so good there. And here we are in this wonderful university, the best public university in the world, prides itself on intellectual property. Over 99% of patents in the United States never get commercialized. You want an example, a very high-tech example? How about wearable technology? How about the zipper? You know how long it took before the zipper made a dime? 80 years. 80 years. Now that's a wearable technology that's transformed clothing, By the way, and you know how it made those dollars originally? Not from pants or skirts or shirts. It made it from zipping up rubber galoshes. And it was the Goodrich company in Akron, Ohio, that thought about how to apply this new wearable technology to a problem that men and women had of that era. So failure, as you heard from this morning from Tim's conversation about how failure plays out in the white space of Facebook, failure is an omnipresent topic. And Scott Adams, who was in our class last week as a guest, has a wonderful book on his own experiences with failure that came out last year. And there are many, many, many other books about this. But when Mark and I looked at these examples, looked at the approaches that were taken by other books, we decided that we thought there was something missing. What we wanted to avoid are 3 categories. First is what we call the kind of hoorah category. And we've all read examples of these. These are personal memoirs. Famous person, I struggled, I persevered, I succeeded, right? And those are marvelously inspiring. They're great to read. The difficulty is it's very hard to apply those lessons widely in your day-to-day lives. We wanted to avoid the rah-rah that you hear all the time around Silicon Valley. Fail often, fail fast, fail forward. Why? Not because we don't think there's wisdom in that, there is, but because we think everybody kind of gets that. And we didn't think another book to cheerlead around the Silicon Valley mantra was going to help all that much. And the third category we wanted to avoid is what we call the blah blah category. And that's the sort of help genre. Again, can be very useful to understand your own personal attitudes about failure, to try to how to cope with it, how to become a bit more tolerant of the risks that are inherent in life. But we wanted not to try to duplicate that. What we really wanted to do is to put a book together that we thought could help executives and leaders, entrepreneurs and team members across the world, whether they're in startups, in medium-sized companies, or in large companies, figure out how to put failure to work. Practically speaking, what is it you can do with this phenomenon called failure? In fact, when we were thinking about it, apropos of the snafu comment, and Mark and I were looking for metaphors for failure, Mark came up with what we think is what I think, he won't say it, but I'll say it, what I think is a wonderful metaphor for failure, and that is it's like gravity. It's like gravity. It's a force of life, it's a fact of nature, and it's something that you have to respect and acknowledge even if you want to fly. So think about it in that context. It's that pervasive. It is likely to be that inevitable in most of what we do. If we wanted to cut to the chase about what we hope people get out of our book and out of thinking about failure differently, what we really are hoping our readers do is to think about failure not as a regrettable event, which we all feel, but to begin to understand that it has the potential to be a strategically valuable resource, on a par with the people you hire, the money you put to work, the technology you have, the franchise, the customer relationships, all of the other strategic resources that you in business or nonprofit organizations are trying to leverage and create value out of. We think failure deserves the same kind of rank as a strategic asset. Mark.
So the key thing, to build on what John just said, we said, how do we look at failure in a way where we can put it to work? And we interviewed hundreds of people for this book. And we had our students interview lots of people too, which was a great benefit. And we looked at hundreds of companies. And we started to see patterns. And we saw patterns. There were general patterns, and we'll introduce that in a minute. And we also saw patterns and examples in companies of all different sizes. This is not just a phenomenon that works in small companies or medium companies or large companies. It works across all of them. And within the book, we actually devote a specific chapter for the different sizes of companies. So we'll give a few examples here, and then we'll kind of take failure apart and put it back together in a way that you can really help put that failure to work. So with small companies, with startups, one of the concepts that's really quite common and popular here is the concept of pivot. In fact, sometimes the concept of pivot, you know when we go through buzzword bingo? You know, you hear pivot 5 times, you go bingo, right? And there's a few more in there. Disruption, we use disruption a lot, there's another one. But pivot is one of those that is a great expression. It was coined here. And we say, okay, so when you fail, sometimes failure says it's time to make a big change. Now, here's an example. And we're going to sprinkle examples through. And in fact, what I'd like to do would be to invite any of you that have other examples, or you say, this is kind of like this, let us know. Because we are always looking for great examples. And you'll see where they might fit as well. So we would invite that kind of a dialogue. Who here uses the mobile application Bourbon? Nobody. Who here drinks bourbon? Yeah. All right. It's a Cal Berkeley crowd. So bourbon, and bourbon doesn't exist anymore. So there's a reason why you're not using it. Bourbon was funded by Andreessen Horowitz with some young entrepreneurs. And it was a combination of many different features. It was a mobile application that had some game elements to it because they liked gaming. It had location-based elements to it. You could check in like you could with Foursquare. It had some e-commerce applications to it. Had a lot of different elements. And it also had a great little camera function as well, photo function. And as the founders of Bourbon, after having worked on this for 2 years, got ready to take it out to market, they spent time and they went back to their beta users, several hundred beta users, and they said, well, what do you think about our baby? And the user said, it sucks. It's too complicated. We don't know when to use it. We're not sure how the pieces all fit together. We really don't like it very much. But we do love this little photo app that you have on the side. And they heard that again and again. So what they did, at first they thought we failed. Then they said, wait a minute, there's, in the ashes of this failure is this great little product called Instagram. And they took the whole engine that they'd been working, they scrapped 90% of the features, and they focused on that one feature, Instagram. And they launched that product less than 2 months later. And we know what happened. This is a company that with less than 2 dozen, I think there were 13 employees at the time, was bought by Facebook for over $1 billion. 13 employees, $1 billion, all by actually finding that nugget inside of a failure. Now, sometimes, instead of pivoting, maybe it makes more sense to say, we're working on something, let's rivet. John?
And there's a mid-sized company, a category that we call growing ups. By the way, this is where most of the economy of the United States and most of the economies around the world depend. on these medium-sized, small and medium-sized companies. And I'll give you one example here, but I want to start with a question. How many of you, if I were to visit your garage or your kitchen cabinet or your utility closet, have this product? Yeah, I thought so. Really? You have that product? I think you might have this product, right? So what's the connection between WD-39 and WD-40? It's an example not of pivoting, but of riveting, of a team that basically, from the Rocket Chemical Company in 1953, had an original idea to create a proprietary, world-changing water displacement formula. And the team of scientists who focused on that job had the confidence, had the tenacity, to basically stay with that original vision through WD1, 2, 3, 39, and by the time they got to 40, they figured it out. And the formula fundamentally hasn't changed in all those years. So don't just think about encountering failure and pivoting away from the failure. Sometimes it's digging in to the failure. It's digging in and sticking with things if you have that particular kind of confidence in what it is you're trying to do, whether you're a startup or a mid-sized organization. Now, we also looked at a lot of grown-up companies. These are the ones that get most of the press outside Silicon Valley. We had a chance to talk with people like Chad Holliday, who's the chairman of the board of Royal Dutch Shell, used to be the CEO of DuPont, is on the board of Bank of America. We had a wonderful conversation with Mark Hoplamassian, who's the CEO of Hyatt Hotels. So we had a chance to talk to a number of CEOs, major players in worldwide commerce. And we wanted to get their insights on this other F word, how they deal with it. I'll share just one small vignette about Mark Hoplamassian at Hyatt. Mark has a phrase that he likes, and it goes like this: version 0.5 beats version 1.0. And what he's trying to do at Hyatt is to lower the threshold before people around that organization take the first step in trying out an idea of theirs. Up until that point, you can imagine the situation, right? People have ideas for new improvements, they have ideas for innovations, they want to try something new in the market, and it would go through the phalanx of committees and processes and formats and templates and different kinds of stage gating reviews and the like. And what happened more often than not was that some very good ideas and the energy behind them began to get stultified. So not enough efforts were happening. So Mark came up with this idea, borrowed from the software industry, and he said, look, I'd rather have more people trying things at an earlier stage and learning from those efforts, those experiments, than I would waiting on the assumption that we know, in all cases, what's really going to work and what's not going to work. So even in these large organizations struggling with the difficulties of scale, they're trying to figure out how to create a more failure-savvy culture through personal example, through a number of systems, and changing the metrics of these large organizations. When Mark and I were talking about putting together all of our interviews, and we've said, well, so what did we learn from startups, what did we learn from growing ups, and what did we learn from these grown-ups, we suddenly said, hey, wait a second, there's a cycle here. The screw-up of the grown-ups became the opportunity for the startups, and the wisest of the startups know that they're going to screw up before they become grown-ups. So there is this kind of repeating pattern, if you will, that links failure across all stages of organizations. It led us to debating. We went through a number of different possibilities for us creating a model or a framework that we thought would be true to our fundamental mission of helping people figure out how to put failure to work. And we ended up identifying something that we've called the failure value cycle. And then the question became, well, okay, we like the idea of cycles. We like the idea of extracting value out of failure. We need something that people can remember. And we went through a number of different ways of doing that, acronyms and mnemonics and all kinds of things. Then we said, no, wait a second, wait, let's learn from the pirates. Let's put every stage in this failure value cycle, let's start every stage with an R. So with apologies to any pirates in the audience, let me just quickly flag these. So this is a 7-stage failure value cycle. It starts fundamentally with respect. Because if you don't respect the very inevitability and universality of failure that we saw when we asked you to share your own experiences with one another, you're starting behind the 8 ball. You really are not yet prepared to understand what a gift failure can be. One of the things we like to say is that reality is failure. Failure is reality's way of telling you what you don't now know and what you do need to know. So starting this off with respect is an important first stage. Then we think the issue is one of rehearse. Why? There's a phrase that was developed elsewhere on campus called high reliability organization. Some of you may be familiar with it in the literature. I'll give you an example of what a high reliability organization is. Hopefully, if it's not in Japan, a nuclear power plant would be a high reliability organization. An operating room in a major hospital would be a high reliability organization. An aircraft carrier, you get the picture. Places where life and death is the metrics and the reality of what they deal with. Those folks do an incredible job of rehearsing and bringing rehearsals into the process of training. They figure out redundancy to deal with the unexpected crisis, whether it's warfare, whether it's natural disaster, or what have you. What we realized when we begin to think about this from the lens of failure is that ask yourself in your own business, what's more likely? The fire drill, earthquake, or maybe even terrorist attack that your organization might encounter, or the kinds of failures that we talked about in the statistics earlier? The new product that's going to fail, the new hire that's not going to work out, the team that's not going to work out, the ad campaign that's going to bomb, the merger or acquisition that doesn't work. Those are the far more likely failures. But more often than not, what we see in organizations when they deal with those relatively predictable failures is that they're very ill prepared for it. They don't quite know how to deal with it, even though they happen over and over again. So we think this stage of rehearse is a very important one as well. Recognize is about how do you extend the perimeter of your business to have an earlier sense of when the symptoms or signals of failure are happening. Fourth, sooner or later failure is going to happen. How do you deal with it? And we'll give you a couple of examples of how people have done it well and how not so well. After it's over, the issue is what do you think about it? How do you reflect deeply, honestly, candidly, openly about not just who was involved, which is what many of us instinctively react to. One of the things, by the way, that Chad Holliday shared with us is one of the things he has trouble with on boards, corporate boards, is when things happen, particularly for publicly held companies, some of the first reactions are, who do we blame, who do we need to fire? And he said, that's not the question to ask. So that's part of turning this issue of what kinds of questions you ask and what sequence around when you get to the issue of the reflect stage. Sooner or later, you have to get back in the game. That's our rebound stage. And finally, one that we think most organizations flunk in this failure context is to remember the entire experience, from the early indicators that failure was happening to how you prepare for it, how you deal with it, what you learn from it, and how you can use that as a way to instill a stronger, more failure-wise culture going forward. Put all that together, and you get our failure value cycle. I'll give you two examples. First, you want companies that recognize the power and potential of failure. You heard about one in the session before us from Tim at Facebook. Google, obviously, is another organization where Mark and I had a chance to talk at the authors at Google a couple of weeks ago. And failure is part of the vocabulary at Google. It just is. People expect it. They talk about it. It's fairly easy topic to get with. Earlier than that, 3M, which is everybody's poster child for a more traditional company that understands the value of failure and experimentation in developing new products. Now, you want an example of failure to rehearse. Here's a business that is in the business of rehearsals. And just think about this issue of rehearsing from the point of view of what are the crown jewels of your business? What are the things without which you would not have a business? And one example from Brian Williams' situation might be as follows. We'll share this if the video works. Do we think the video's going to work?
Let's find out.
Let's try it. This is always tempting fate. Oh, there went Brian. You know why? Because
it's a thing that you build slowly, over time. And what you build, if you work hard enough, if you respect it, is a powerful thing called trust.
If you're in the business of reporting the news, what's the asset that you have that's most important? It's credibility. It's trust. And normally, If we've been flying in a helicopter in the Middle East that got either hit by gunfire or the one next to us got hit by gunfire and we were forced to land, and we exaggerated the story a little bit, that wouldn't be the type of incident that would cause you to potentially lose your job. That would bring embarrassment upon the entire organization. But when your crown jewel is trust, and you do something to damage that, the implications are huge. So one of the things that we focus on, in particular in this stage, in the failure value cycle, is it's an exercise that we call identify and protect your crown jewels. What are those crown jewels that really matter to your customers, to your stakeholders? Let's look at another example, Target stores, the hack that took place a year and a half ago. Customer data, payment information. When you think about what's important to a retailer, that's it. And while it looked like that was maybe one of those shit happens events, it turns out, as we've peeled back on that particular hack, they knew that there were weaknesses. They just hadn't acted upon them yet. So it really wasn't, well, this just happened to us. So one of the things that we say is to be better with failure is to understand what your crown jewels are and to rehearse around those so that you understand what to do if there is a failure event, and you try and avoid that. And you know, as John said, we spoke with a lot of leaders in this area. And this was one of those areas in the failure value cycle that we debated about because we said, rehearse, does it matter? When we spoke to fighter pilots in the Navy and in the Air Force, we spoke with Mark Larrett, who runs the UCSF Med Center and Hospital. We spoke with others that run these high reliability organizations. They were adamant. They said, not only is it really important for high reliability organizations, but for high resiliency organizations that need to respond to a variety of different types of inputs, you have to rehearse. So think about those areas where failure may happen and rehearse for those. There we go. Take a second to step back. One of the things that was really fascinating when we started talking to leaders, we weren't sure how they would respond to us. And some didn't want to talk about it. But the leaders that were the most enlightened, and in many cases the most successful, were the ones that said, we're happy to talk about failure. John mentioned a few of them. Jeffrey Bucas of Time Warner, somebody that neither one of us know, but we put out the word, and he responded right away. He said, failure has been one of those greatest assets that I've used, and here's how I've used it. In fact, he liked this topic so much that he wrote the foreword for our book. Julie Wainwright of Pets.com fame. If we remember Pets.com, which was a big failure, kind of helped us understand what happened there, and then said, it took me a while to get over that, but now she's running an e-commerce site called The Real Real, which in less than 3 years has blown through more than $100 million in sales, not in invested capital, and has a different business model that is fundamentally profitable that she understood and learned from some of her failures. So those are just a few examples. Who here likes to fish? Does anybody like to fish? So this is not a technology company. This is Northland Fishing Tackle. We're going to talk about it. So Northland Fishing Tackle was founded 40, 50 years ago by a fishing guide who started making great lures. And he made those lures for his clients and then eventually started selling them and created a fishing tackle company in Bemidji, Minnesota. Pat McIntyre was the chairman of Northland Fishing Tackle and put in place, had run a number of more sophisticated businesses, loved to fish, was an investor and the chairman of the company, not the founder. And he put in place some metrics. Was not running the company, was not the CEO. And what he saw, and we're now at the recognized stage, was some of those metrics started to slip. Not a lot, but a little. And when you think about failures, a lot of times the failures are immediate, but this was what we call a slow fuse failure. And he looked at these metrics around inventory turns, profitability, margins, obsolete inventory, and he said, you know, we've got a failure that's happening here. And I started tracking it. And at a certain point, he realized that if they didn't do something fundamentally different, this was one of those companies, those 50-year-old companies, that was slowly going to slide into obscurity because they didn't change what they were doing. And what Pat then did was stepped in and said, we're going to fundamentally change the way we do our business because we've recognized that we are on a downward path, that if we don't change, if we're stuck in the static quo, not the status quo, but the static quo, we will ultimately fail. And he put together a turnaround a couple of years ago. The company is now much more profitable and is growing again the way that we wanted to see it grow before. Now, when a failure happens, the key thing you want to do is to react properly and in the moment. Now, a couple of giggles here. Lululemon. Their yoga pants were a little bit too sheer, as it turned out. So they reacted, and they pulled their yoga pants back, and they created new yoga pants. Well, those new yoga pants, it turned out, didn't work very well either. They had some production problems. So the chairman and the founder of Lululemon goes on the air to talk about what's happening. And this is that moment where you have the opportunity, if you react well, to call upon the goodwill that you have in your customers and your partners. And this is what,
Hold on.
And this is what he said.
Some women's bodies just actually don't work for it.
The company's founder, Chip Wilson, appearing to suggest it's his customers who are the problem.
You know, really about the rubbing through the thighs.
And now, 1 week and plenty of outrage later, a very necessary apology posted online.
I'm sad. I'm really sad.
Off to a good start, right? Let's hear some more.
I'm sad for the people of Lululemon who I care so much about that have really had to face the brunt of my actions.
Not a very good reaction. And for those of you that know, he's no longer at Lululemon. Basically, the rest of the investors, even some of his internal folks, forced him out. The stock dropped more than 50% in the period immediately following that, not just because of the problems the company had, but because of what he as a leader did to damage the brand and the credibility of the company. We're going to talk about a better way to react later. In fact, let's use this next one, which is Netflix, and I'll set it up for a moment. As to what you do next, as John shared, you react in the moment to stabilize whatever the situation is, whether it's a slow fuse failure, like we saw with Northland Fishing, or whether it's kind of an emergency, as we saw with Lululemon. Now, Netflix created its own problem. How many people remember Quickster, which Netflix wishes you didn't remember? A couple of years ago, Netflix, which started as a DVD by mail company, moved into streaming, decided to split its businesses and rename the DVD by mail company Quickster, with price increases attached to all of that, especially if you wanted to remain a customer of both. They announced that, and immediately millions of customers started leaving. They lost 3/4 of their market cap within just a couple of months. And everybody assumed that Netflix was going to be acquired because of this disaster, this failure they had brought upon themselves. Here's what Reed Hastings did when that happened.
Hi, I'm Reed Hastings, CEO and co-founder of Netflix.
I'm Andy Rendich, and I head up DVD operations at Netflix.
We've been working for the past 14 years to build Netflix year by year into the best possible service we could build. And we're making this video today to apologize in person, or at least on camera, for something that we did recently.
So he went out, made a sincere apology. He went on to say, we heard you, we're going to fix it. He also wore that really bright aqua shirt, which I wasn't sure was really a great CEO move, but he came out and said, we're going to fix this problem, stay with us. And they did. And what happened was they reflected upon what was happening, not only the problem they had brought upon themselves, but think back a couple of years. The way that we consume media was fundamentally changing. We now watch it on tablets, we watch it on our phones, we watch it everywhere. Content was increasingly important. Netflix was in the business of distributing other people's content. Netflix actually took a cue from HBO and other content providers and started creating its own content, like House of Cards and others. Huge fan of House of Cards, by the way. I don't know how many of you are. And they started creating great content. What Netflix then did is it passed HBO as the biggest subscriber base as content goes, recovered all of their stock value and then some. So what they did is they reflected on that failure. Not only did they respond to the immediate failure, but they said, what's going on more broadly? We're going to have to change direction. And as a result, they have become that much more of a successful company. What we call this is being failure savvy as a leader. It's the way that we process failure. Marvel's another example. So once you have reflected, then what do you do to rebound? What game plan do you put in place to rebound from those failures? Now, Marvel, storied brand, comic book brand, bankruptcy in the mid-1990s for a number of reasons, including the fact that the comic strip business the comic book business really started to shrink. What did Marvel do? It rethought its strategy fundamentally and said, we're a media company, not a comic book company. While it had been involved in creating some movies, said, let's become much more involved in movies. It also crafted a strategy that said, the characters are what's really important in our movies. So when they cast those characters, in many instances, they didn't cast big stars. So they were able to create movies for far less. So they created highly profitable movies based on franchise characters that could live outside of the movie stars, and they created that much more profitability. They rebuilt the business, came out of bankruptcy. They were purchased by Disney in 2009 for more than $4 billion. They executed that rebound strategy incredibly well. Failure, reflect, what are we going to do differently, and then executed that really well. And then finally is remember. The remember stage is the one that John also referenced, is one that we typically don't do terribly well. You know, one of the companies that we looked at that we thought does this incredibly well, both on the respect stage and on the remember stage, is Bessemer Venture Partners, venture capital firm in Silicon Valley that has an anti-portfolio on their website. So if you go to Bessemer Venture Partners, they will tell you how they passed on Intel, Federal Express. They will tell you the story of how one of the founders of Bessemer Partners was visiting a home in Silicon Valley, and the woman said, I've got these 2 young Stanford PhD students working in the garage. They're creating a new search engine. And he says, we don't need another new search engine. How can I get out of this house without going anywhere near the garage? And that was Sergey and Larry, and that was Google. So they share these stories of how they failed, and they do so with a certain humility that says, we know we make mistakes, but it also shows how they think about moving beyond those mistakes. So that's the remember stage. In fact, another invitation. John and I wanted to offer up the invitation. If you read the book and you find a mistake, let us know, because we're going to put all of our mistakes, failures, and bloopers online in the spirit of living with our topic here. How do you then remember effectively? There's 4 steps. Number 1, it's the words that you use. It's how you think about talking about failure from the standpoint of, do we think about it as positive or negative outcomes, or do we think about it as failures? How do you kind of communicate those failures within your organizations? And consistent with the words, it's the questions you ask. It's what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen, before we say who screwed up and who do we need to fire. And then it's the stories you tell. And it's one of the reasons why we embed so many stories in our talk today, because the stories are what is memorable. And that includes, for example, this project didn't work out, but the person who was leading it then went on to lead the next project, which became the biggest hit in the company's history. So the stories that you tell that get embedded. And it's the relics that you have. Wouldn't it be great if you showed up at the Rocket Chemical Company and you saw WD1, WD2, WD3 to show how they've continued to remember that they weren't always successful. So those are 4 elements that we say are crucial for the remember stage.
So think back to the assignment we gave you early on. We asked you to spend just 30 seconds thinking about a professional or business failure that you'd experienced or been involved with in some way. And we asked you to think about the insight, the lesson that you drew from that. When we offered this, our other F-word class for the first time at Haas, one of the things that we did is ask the students to be intellectual scouts on behalf of all of us in the class. So they all fanned out. They read a lot of books. They talked to a lot of people. And at the end, the final class, a woman came up at the end and said, you know, it really struck me that it seems like the half-life of failure is so much longer than the half-life of success. That we can vividly remember personal and professional failures decades in some cases after they happened. But trying to bring forth those memories in as vivid a way of the successes that we've experienced is for many of us very, very difficult. So why is that going on? Well, we think it has a lot to do with how we think about, feel about this other F word. And the difficulty here is that we're trapped seemingly between two distorted mirrors, one of which looks to the past and one of which anticipates the future. It's as if we're in a kind of funhouse of mirrors. On the one hand, we so vividly recall through memory the failures that have happened to us, the failures that we've seen. By the way, some very interesting research that we talk about in the book comes from the world of behavioral economics as well as psychology in this regard, that we're not alone in being able to remember failure so powerfully. One of the things that Dan Kahneman, a colleague of mine, I also teach at Princeton in the fall, one of the things that Dan Kahneman talks about in his books is this issue of the long memory. He talks about the importance of watching how failures end, and we'll get to that in a second, precisely because of this memory effect. So that's about what we remember from the past. That would be tough enough as it is. But when you're trying to get your organization, your team, your startup, your big organization to innovate, to engage its employees more genuinely, it's flipped to the fear that we have of failure going forward. And the fear that we have tends to both distort the likelihood of failure and perhaps magnify the consequences if and when failure does occur. So we seem trapped in between these two mirrors, one to the past, one to the fore. So we wanted to leave you with 5 very specific things that we'd suggest you might want to try as a way of applying some of the things that we've learned through our odyssey into this frontier of failure. The first is, think about your organization potentially as a portfolio of failure zones. Chances are you have business units, you have divisions, you have functions, you have titles, you have an org chart. But think for a moment, if you're concerned about innovation, growth, and employee engagement, think about what's your organization look like as a portfolio of failure zones. In some cases, you may have, and probably do have, aspects of your operations where failure should not be tolerated, right? There are certain things in your organization where failure simply is not acceptable, either because of life and death, or because of corporate brand, or because of ethical compliance, whatever it may be. Those are areas that are sort of no failure zones. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to encounter failure. That's where the rehearsal comes to play very, very strongly. But nonetheless, there are probably areas in every organization where failure is just verboten. Next, think about what you might characterize as the area of improvement, where you have to be willing to tolerate failure in order to get even incremental improvement of your operating efficiency, your strategies, your teams, et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of the world of Six Sigma, if you want to think about it. You know, continually pushing the edge of performance, trying to reduce unnecessary and unpredictable kinds of deviance from manufacturing processes and the like. You want to steadily improve the bar here. But lastly, think about the rest of your organization, where just to characterize the difference between Six Sigma, think about these zones as zero stigma zones. Places where you want to actively encourage a great degree of experimentation. You're willing to encounter a tremendous amount of risk. You want lots of creativity. And you want people to feel free to engage in that activity without worrying about their job, their paycheck, or what have you. Those are zero stigma zones. So that's one. Second, Mark alluded to this earlier. Focus in particularly on the crown jewels of your organization. Think about applying the ungolden rule to yourself. What's the ungolden rule? Do unto you before others have a chance to do it unto you. And all you have to do is read Innovator's Dilemma or think about all of the companies that we've all seen that have died that were at one point major, major players in their industries who failed to do this particular exercise. And because they stayed on their strategy too long, they stayed confident of their future too long, left themselves vulnerable. And that's why we said earlier, your screw-up became the opportunity for my startup. Third, listen for the sound of running water. I'm going to use an example from the world of biology and nature. Always tough to use this as an example. The North American beaver. Why? The amazing thing about this animal is that its signal to build a dam out in the middle of the forest is the same signal that it uses to repair that dam so that the lodge in which its family is living can be protected. And what is that sound? The sound of running water. By the way, it's interesting, this little animal. Turns out this animal is the second most able animal, other than man, to manipulate nature to its own advantages. But think about that in your organization. Think about that metaphor. Where's the running water? Chances are it's on the perimeter of your organization. It may be just on the other side of your existing business today. That's what you need to be listening for. Because chances are that's where the next generation of startups, the new technologies, the new business models, the new ways of leading and motivating people, the new ways of organizing resources, that's where those are likely to be camped out. You need to be perimeter watchers, monitoring the running water of your particular enterprise. Fourth, something I alluded to from the work of behavioral economics, pay attention to how failures in your organization end. They're going to happen all over the place. But pay particular attention as a leader to how they end. And as Mark was suggesting, think about the sequence with which you ask the questions once they happen. Why, where, how, what happened, well before you get to the issue of who. And if you have trouble remembering that, slow down and pronounce the word itself. Failure. Why? Because if you're really honest and humble, and maybe have a little bit of humor about what just happened, chances are you may find your own fingerprints on the failure that you're concerned about. So think about the sequence with which you ask the questions, and in particular, what happens to the people who were involved in that failure. I was just in Akron, Ohio this week with Hank Chesborough, talking to his Open Innovation Forum, a group of major companies from around the world. And Hank has a statement that we included in the book. He said, everybody wants to talk about being an innovative company. But he said, if you show me a company where the people involved in a failure have either been penalized, fired, or exiled to the corporate version of Siberia, I'll show you a company that's not at all innovative. You can't be innovative and not have a savvy attitude, an accepting attitude towards failure. And lastly, and this may be heresy, we know. Here we are, we teach at this fancy business school, you all have gone here. But the fifth and final suggestion we have for you is don't always think like an MBA. This is an opportunity for you to channel your inner engineer, for example, because engineering has a whole discipline around failure analysis. They learn about it, they train in it. There are many, many examples of insights that have come out of that particular discipline from the world of engineering. Or maybe think like an author. What's the world of an author in terms of creating an article or book? It's filled with drafts. Lots and lots, more drafts than Mark and I care to acknowledge.
We had a lot of drafts.
Before you get to a book. But think about what those drafts are. Those drafts are early tries at an idea, at a project, et cetera. And if you can accept that drafting process, you might be able to learn some things faster. Or channel your inner scientist. One of the other insights that came from our class, which I was thrilled to hear Tim mention earlier in his comments, is the language of experiment. Think about the language, the vocabulary that you use in your organization. It's usually the language of project, product, strategy, transaction. You know, it's the business language, right? It's the language we all learn about here at the business school. Imagine if you just change that a little bit and start talking about experiments. Because what, after all, are new products, new hires, new strategies, new mergers and acquisitions? They're experiments. They are assertions into the face of uncertainty, and reality's waiting to tell you what you don't know yet. So think about the language of experiment, and it may give you a different attitude, a different approach, and give your culture a different understanding of the likelihood of failure happening along the way to discovery. Or if you're artistically bent, think about how artists use negative space. Think about how they turn perception on its head in order to create a different kind of insight into what is going on. Whether you're an engineer, whether you're an artist, whether you're an author, there are other disciplines there besides having an MBA that may give you access to the kind of insight that prevents you from flunking failure. And that's the last thing in the world we want to do as teachers here at Haas. We want you to basically pass it. So what do we do, Mark?
Well, let's wrap up so we can take a couple of questions, because you now have your degree in failure or in being a failure-savvy leader. We have a tool or two for you as well. First of all, we actually created a report card that takes you through all of the 7 cycles with a half a dozen questions each to say how failure-savvy is your organization. Use it as we've presented it in the book, or create your own, use those as examples. And that's available for anybody. If you want an excerpt from the book, the failure value cycle, the graphic, and this report card, just go to the otherfwordbook.com. You need to put book in there, otherwise you end up at another F-word site. I'm not sure you want to go there. So, the otherfwordbook.com, and that will help you ace failure as opposed to flunk failure. So the thing we'll leave you with here today is to use failure. It is like gravity. It's everywhere. It will help you drive the growth you're seeking, the innovation that you and the market and your colleagues want, and it will help you drive that employee engagement that creates a better workplace and a better performing organization. So the one last thing that another resource is we actually wrote a manifesto about this, and the manifesto is Unlocking Failure's Grip on the Static Quo, and that's available at this particular URL, or just Google that with change this, and all of these resources I know will be available to you later. So let's see if we have time for a couple of questions around failure, and the final word on this is remember that failure is today's lesson for tomorrow. So thank you very much.
First prize. Do we have mics? Do we have, yes we do. Great.
Rebecca,
thank you so much. By the way, every teacher likes the first person who raises their hand. One of the people that we interviewed for the book is the CEO of Avon, Sherry McCoy, and she talks about one of her challenges in dealing with failure across that huge organization that has 1 million salespeople basically working on virtually every continent in almost all countries. She said, I basically want to make it possible for people to raise their hand. That's the culture I want, a raise your hand culture. So what you may not have seen there is we just gave the book, a copy of the book, to the guy who was the first person to raise his hand. So go ahead.
Yes, Yan Chao, class of 2005. I was intrigued by your statement that many of the most successful leaders that you interview were also most savvy with failure. And sometimes the issue is not the failure, it's the success. You know, what do you do with success? Are they both the same size and the different side of the same coin?
I'm glad.
Is it their perspective that gets them through? Yes, that's the question.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We started off thinking that success was the opposite of failure. We don't think that's quite right. We think it's more like the sibling of failure. And to your point, we just did an interview in Fast Company on exactly this issue, that how can you learn the lessons of success fast enough to be able to complement what you're getting from failure. So we think if the issues are innovation, if the issues are employee engagement, you need to be able to, you need to comfortably get your arms around this issue of the other F word. We had a chance in our book to work with the organization called Great Place to Work Institute. They're the people behind the Fortune magazine, 100 Best Places to Work all over the world. And their big lesson in all of the research they've done back for 25 years is the importance of trust. And they say trust is forged in failure, basically. It's when things are going south. So the question about success and failure, they're in a dance with one another. We think it's important to focus on both. What usually happens in organizations with success is they don't spend enough time understanding why that success happened. And it's not just a matter of luck, although there's a fair amount of serendipity involved. So we see it as intertwined and important to look in similar kinds of ways into the world of success as well as failure.
Yeah, and there's actually a partner to both of those, which is context. Because if you think about it, the same idea with the same team and the same execution, 3 years later, 5 years later, might have a fundamentally different outcome. So I gave the example of Pets.com. And everybody thought back in 1999 and 2000 that what a stupid idea ordering dog food online, 40-pound bags of dog food online delivered for free. That will never happen. Go to Amazon today, right? 40 pounds of dog food, you want it tomorrow, it'll cost you an extra $3. So context is really important there, and I think that I would mimic what John said or echo what John said, which is understand why you were successful and why timing was right, because timing is hugely important in a lot of these things.
By the way, on that timing issue, when it's available, you might want to check a TED Talk from Vancouver just last month on the importance of timing as a differentiator between success and failure. Really interesting, from the guy who founded Idea Lab.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Or here, yeah, it's up here.
And then we've got one at the microphone too. Yeah.
From a system, economic system level, have you looked at ways to improve the amount of innovation in an economy by reducing the punishment, the negative aspects on innovators of being serial innovators project after project after project?
Well, so do we have specific numbers on that? No. But let's just do some really basic math, which says if you want to innovate, you have to do things differently. If you do things differently, you have to take risks. When you take risks, a certain percent of those will fail. So if you were to follow A equals B, B equals C, et cetera, then you would say to drive greater innovation, which will then lead to that greater growth, certain parts of the organization, John referenced the different failure zones, need to embrace the willingness to have outcomes that are negative outcomes. The other thing that we didn't talk about specifically is that if you think about, if you leverage the language of science, where you say whether you have a hypothesis and you'll have a positive outcome or a negative outcome, in either instance, you will have greater knowledge, and that greater knowledge can then be put to work, and that can be put to work to drive those innovations we're talking about.
One other dimension on that is the cultural side of this. Yeah. And I don't mean culture just in the sense of organizational culture, which is incredibly important, but global culture. Mark was in France last week. I was talking with a group of Koreans. We had a group of Norwegians here earlier. This issue of fear of failure, of the stigma associated with failure, is a universal one.
A different side to this, and that would be that if we look at Berkeley, for example, as a global tier 1 university, and then we have these, I'll be just cavalier.
Can everybody hear, by the way, in the back?
Yeah.
Can you turn the microphone on, Martin, or whoever's? There you go.
Okay.
You got it.
So Berkeley's a global tier 1 university, right? And let's say that, I'm just being cavalier, let's say there's 30 of those. And when we come in as graduate students, we can take routes of being safe. We could also, as things are emerging, try to take routes as faculty members of the tier 1 global universities to be able to be part of basic research, applied research, and commercialization. Or we can be out in the marketplace as owners of companies who are doing these things. Mm-hmm. They have choices in the career paths will have different impacts on their own personal risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and have you been thinking about, because we know also superficially that people will say, what is a differentiator between the probability of success or failure of a particular startup, and often people will say it's the value of your network.
or the value of timing, or a lot of other things. But I would just, let me just offer one thing.
But you could possibly drive the probability of failure of 75% that you were showing on the chart way, way down.
You might not even have to drive it way, way down. Yeah. And when you look at the fine line that differentiates failure from success in business, particularly for those small and medium businesses, sometimes a 1 or 2% difference may be the difference of living or not living. Yeah. Let me hand it over, if I can, to your neighbor here who had.
And then let's go up there.
Sure.
Sharon Caucus, class of 90. Have you researched any companies that undertook large-scale business transformation efforts? I was at a company where they tried that 3 times, spent a lot of money, and still failed. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to changing the paradigm on how companies operate on a broader scale, how do you either break down the modes of failure so that they could at least succeed, remember how they got there, and rebound from such a failure?
So one of the ways that we've looked at in general in organizations is this whole concept of failure zones. Because when you take a look at undergoing a major transformation, you're talking about reorganization, changing focus, things like that. We spoke with the former CEO of Charles Schwab, Dave Pottruck. And what he said was there were times when they were trying to drive massive change in their products because the market was requiring that, and they would enable and encourage failure. Whereas there were others in their transaction processing where they said, no, this is not an area where we have billions of dollars every day going through this that we can encourage or even allow failure. So the way that we've looked at that, and this is what we heard back from CEOs that have undertaken major change, is they compartmentalize those failure zones to encourage failure, or at least, if not encourage it, at least acknowledge it and embrace it in that way.
Let me give you 2 examples, though, because you were asking for some specifics. Think about what IBM has done. At least 3 or 4 times in its evolution. Those are wholesale corporate transformations. Fundamental changes in the business model, driven to some extent by previous mistakes in some cases, or the turf that they left open, but they learned from those mistakes soon enough to avoid the fate that befell many, many, many other players in their industry and elsewhere. And then think about one that a lot of people would count out right now, is Nokia. You know what Nokia started out as? A timber company, a lumber products company. And just think about the number of transformations that company is going through. Now, are they on the ropes now? Yes, absolutely, they're on the ropes. They lost their worldwide franchise, their global leadership position in mobile. But I wouldn't count them out because they're one of the few cultures across the landscape of business that has been capable time and time again of fundamentally transforming.
Those are great examples. Let's do our last question.
Yeah, one up at the top here. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, hi, Esther Saidman, class of 90. I'm curious as to your ideas on change management. So if you're trying to build a culture of change in, let's say, a highly regulated, risk-averse type of company, what are your tips in moving forward?
Couple of suggestions for you. One, there's another book that you might want to look at called Heart of Change, written by John Kotter at Harvard Business School. And the reason I recommend that is that it is so intuitively understandable and practically applicable. And it talks about not change from the point of view of what a consultant says the organization needs to do, but how you reach the hearts of the people that you're dealing with. And that also is a segue into how important we think it is to deal with failure. Because people aren't stupid in organizations, right? Leaders aren't stupid, employees aren't stupid, but most organizations can't get out of their own way. Mark alluded to the statistics on disengaged employees. It turns out that Gallup has done all kinds of research on this. Over 80% of employees in most organizations, even in the United States, are fundamentally disengaged with their work. And the numbers get even worse when you get outside the United States. So what's going on there? We think a lot has to do with opening up just the pure conversation about failure, about perceived risk, and what the consequences are of doing something different, change in your question. So I think you can actually get these things started with some very simple, personal, human-to-human kinds of interactions. Open up the conversation. Show that as a leader you're comfortable in talking about your own failures. Chris Michael, a serial entrepreneur who's one of the subjects of a book called The Intelligent Entrepreneur, shared a story. He starts every one of his ventures with a failure, it's a failure marathon session. He leads with his own. And he said, A lot of them are so funny. They were painful at the time, but they're so funny to talk about. He doesn't do that just as a matter of wearing a hair shirt. He does it because he wants his people to know that if he's comfortable talking about his own screw-ups, they hopefully are more comfortable in talking sooner about their own and each other's, so that they can get on to the business of improving what needs to happen in the business itself. So don't underestimate the power of just straight up conversation, and then take a look at Cotter's book.